The butterfly effect I've always found to be a unique saying in which the flapping of the wings of a butterfly can cause massive tsunamis halfway across the world. And in the fact that these very small things can essentially cause unrelated things to happen in almost a domino effect. And I really want to kind of apply this to, once again, to one of my favorite subjects, which is the Funimation, in the sense that, this company really did so much for the industry, especially from the 90s throughout the mid to late 2010s, that without Funimation really being here, especially for the English speaking market, it really would have had a really drastic, differently effect on what the outcome of the anime industry would look like today. And I thought that would be kind of an interesting thing to look at in the sense of almost one of these Thanos snapping his fingers what if scenarios of what would the industry be like without Funimation.
In this hypothetical,
Gen would have either pursued a career in electrical engineering and never dabbled in the anime scene at all, or potentially he tried to form Funimation, but either the Japanese side of things just never gave him the titles he wanted or didn't have the financial backing to do so. Under this circumstance,
I really would see a handful of scenarios play out.
the short and sweet answer to this question is that more than likely Viz Media would have picked up the rights to most, if not all, of Funimation's most heavy hitting titles. The reason I say this is because Viz Media already has the manga rights to many of these very popular titles, so synergistically it made the most sense, especially considering Viz already had the rights to Naruto, Boruto, and Bleach, just to name a few. Now, I will say, as a counter argument, it is possible that one of the other anime distributors at the time during the 90s and 2000s could have picked up some of these titles, especially Yu Yu Hakusho and Fruits Baskets among some of the more B and C grade titles that Funimation had picked up at the time. Especially when you look at companies such as ADV Films and Central Park Media, more than likely could have done this. Most of the other outfits that were operating at this time, such as Animigo, I don't really think would have tried to pursue many of the titles that Funimation had for various reasons, but I will just leave it at bandwidth and desire to leave it at that. This is where things start getting interesting with the butterfly effect. One of the first things I'd like to bring up is the voice actor. Funimation really fostered and, promoted a lot of really high quality talent in the Texas market. And I will say that many voice actors did end up doing work at ADV Films at the time as well, but there also were many that either did no work or very little with ADV as well. And it would be really interesting to see how many of these actors would have never had careers in voice acting if it wasn't for Funimation. Another thing I'd like to bring up is Toonami. Now, when you look back at especially the early era of Toonami's existence, the three big titles, Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, and Gundam Wing. And it really would have been interesting to see that if Funimation never existed, would Viz have had Dragon Ball at the time? Would they have pushed it Toonami as hard as Jason DeMarco would have, trying to pursue anime at the time? And it really would have been interesting to see what the landscape would have been like because Dragon Ball at the time was such a major property, even going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, that it almost would be unfathomable to think about what early anime fandom would be without this.
Keystone Anime. Even Toonami recently acknowledged how important Dragon Ball was to the network, especially after the recent passing of Akira Toriyama.
Man, losing one of the greatest manga creators of all time really sucks.
But Akira Toriyama's monumental influence on the medium will live on forever.
Back in '98, Dragon Ball Z put Toonami on the map.
And the Dragon Ball franchise has been our rock ever since.
One of the other things I also like to bring up is also One Piece. As some older fans will remember, 4Kids had the original English rights to One Piece, and they gave it its own unique spin to the series, going up through the end of the Alabasta arc. And the thing that I find interesting is that, Funimation was able to get these rights back from 4Kids and really spent years rekindling the love for this particular series. And I really don't think if it wasn't for Funimation, this series would have lingered in obscurity, being, arguably one of the most popular manga in the world, but just having really no real presence here in the English speaking world, which would have been a crying shame to say the least.
And without building up a adequate fan base in the West, arguably speaking, the live action One Piece made by Netflix arguably would never have been made. One of the other things I also like to bring up is a lot of anime movies as well, where, Funimation really was one of the few companies prior to G Kids that really actively tried to pursue titles such as Summer Wars and Boy and the Beast, among many others, that arguably would have lingered in obscurity just as much as some of the more niche titles.
Another small component I also like to bring up is also the fandom itself, where, back in the 90s and 2000s, there were also a lot of anime conventions that were slowly growing over time. And, really, Funimation had built up a great relationship with the, English speaking fandom, going to many conventions, helping out anime clubs, doing a lot of these things that a lot of people don't really think about especially in a post streaming world. Another major point I'd like to bring up is what happened during the 2008-2009 recession, where many of the anime companies ended up going out of business. And the thing is that there's two different ways I could look at this. On the more extreme end of the cycle, I could see that many of the companies, such as Central Park Media and ADV, among many others, would have gone out of business, essentially leaving a massive vacuum void in distribution here in the English speaking world, which, it's really difficult to say whether or not that would have ever recovered. The other one being that, like, well, without having Funimation present, essentially prices may not have been inflated as high as they were back in the 2000s, leaving companies like ADV and many others not having to compete as heavily against each other for these titles, and potentially could have weathered the storm as well. But once again, we'll never 100% know what could or could not have happened. But more than likely, I don't think ADV would have survived, especially knowing a lot about their business practices at the time. Now, I do believe that a company similar to Crunchyroll eventually would have taken over, and, streaming would have taken off on its own regard sometime in the late aughts, early 2010s. But I don't really think that some companies like Amazon and Netflix would have tried to pursue anime as hard.
As we see today. But one of the final points I would like to bring up is once again going back to the convention scene, where I don't really think that a lot of the anime conventions would have grown to the level that we would have seen today, where just looking at the United States, we have the top 10 biggest conventions range from 20,000 people to over 100,000 people at Anime Expo. And I definitely feel that things would have been much smaller, much more niche than what we see today. But these are just my thoughts and opinions. If you have any other potential ideas of, what if, Funimation, I would love to hear them. Please like and subscribe, and look out for my next video.